Well, a very good morning to you. Hi, my name is Cassim, and welcome back again to my podcast. I hope all is well whenever you're listening to this. In today's podcast, what I wanted to do is I wanted to go through, those of you who can see this online, this title of What Nearly Broke Me, but Built Six Books Out of It, and how it might be able to do the same for you. Now, you will know if you've followed me for any period of time that my name is Cassim and I'm a psychotherapist and I have a counseling practice called Male Minds Counseling, which is specifically aimed at boys and men. And in my full-time job, so I do that part-time, and in my part-time job, I work for the biggest online mental health company in the UK. And I go across all of Southwest London, which is Croydon, Merton, Sutton, Kingston, Richmond, and Wandsworth, doing workshops in primary schools, secondary schools, colleges, sixth forms, universities, essentially anywhere where there's young people between the ages of 10 and 25. And do workshops on healthy relationships, on mental health, on male-focused mental health, on kindness and empathy, on all sorts of different topics. And in the process of doing that, one of the things that tends to happen is that I get many students ask me how about me, like what's my story? How did I end up doing that job? And many times I share with students about my story and how I ended up ultimately writing six books, not because I wanted to, but for various reasons, which we're going to talk about today. And they can't fathom it. They can't understand how I've done it, especially bearing in mind my background and where I started. So, what I wanted to do today is I don't want to go from the very beginning of my story, but what I wanted to do is go through the books that I've written and I wanted to go through why I wrote them and what the link is between all of my books and why in the world, as somebody who was broke, as somebody who grew up on a council estate, as somebody who was in debt, why in the world and how in the world could I go from that to then writing six books and having them published and people purchasing them? So let me take you. I think the best place for me to take you is what happened when I ended up working in a high school. So I'd reached a point in my life where I was very suicidal, and I was like, right, okay, I've tried to kill myself once, and then the second time I tried to kill myself, I survived, obviously. And then I got to a point where I was like, clearly this is not working. Clearly, me trying to kill myself is not working. Because at that point in my life, I was feeling like I'm not worthy, I'm unlovable, I'm stupid, I'm pathetic, no one's going to accept me, I don't know where I belong, I'm worthless. If I died, no one would miss me. The world would actually be a better place if I wasn't here. That was the kind of mentality that I was going through because you have to remember that I had just been homeless for 8 months. I'd been in debt. I was addicted to porn. I had had payday loans out, so I had bailiffs chasing me. At that point in my life, I had been an alcoholic. I had been involved with the police, where I'd been pepper sprayed by the police for trying to punch a police officer. Um, and so my life had really been spiraling out of control. And I got to the point where I was like, clearly this isn't working. And that was when I came across a man called Jim Rohn. And Jim Rohn said a number of statements which basically changed my life. Now, I'm obviously going an overview of this because loads of things happen in this. But Jim Rohn said, if you want things to change, you have to change. He said, if you want things to get better, you have to get better. Don't wish for less problems, wish for more skills. In other words, Jim Rohn said that I, as a person, could actually grow beyond my problems, that I could improve, that I had choices. You have to understand that prior to this, I didn't know that human beings could mold, they could change, they could evolve, they could transform, they could redeem themselves, that they could literally unlock their greatness and go and pursue excellence and become competent and literally become winners. I didn't know this. This path then led me to where a path where I was like, okay, so how do I do this and what do I want to do in my life? And I was like, I really want to work with other people who are going through this, but I want to work with younger people, not really like adults. So I was like, I really want to become a youth worker. The problem was to become a youth worker, you needed A levels and you needed a degree. And I didn't see myself as an academic person. Remember my mentality? I had what in psychology or in some circles is called a fixed mindset where I believe this is how the world is, this is who I am, I can't change, nothing can change for me. So that's it. Instead of having the opposite, which is a growth mindset, which is I can grow, I can improve, things can get better for me, that kind of mentality. So the next best thing that I thought was I will go and work in a school, but not as a teacher, but in some way as like a behavior support worker or a teaching assistant. And I ended up working as a behavior support worker. And whilst I was working in the school, what ended up happening was that I ended up speaking to a lot of students. And many students, of course, would share with me lots of information about themselves. They do loads of self-disclosures. And they would ask me, "Oh, Mr. K, how did you get to this point? How did you turn your life around?" All of this sort of stuff. And what ended up happening was that I began to realize that the students that I was dealing with the vast majority of the time were the same students. Um, and they all had similar ways of thinking. They would say similar types of things. They would have similar types of challenges. They would have same types of attitudes. They were getting in trouble with the same types of things. And so what ended up happening was I basically began to study the students. And I was like, what do they all have in common? So, for example, because I had access to all the records of the students, I opened up the records and I began to realize that many of these kids didn't have fathers or because there wasn't a father on the record. So many of the kids who were getting into trouble, there wasn't a father. They may have been a mother, a grandparent, an uncle, a cousin, someone like that, but there wasn't usually a father. But one of the other things that became very apparent to me as I started studying the kids who I was dealing with, because I was a behavior support worker. So my job was kids who were truanting, weren't going to lesson, kids who were autistic, had ADHD, had big kicked out lessons, all that sort of stuff. My job was to go find them and work with them. And so one of the other things that I discovered was that many of these kids basically they were ignorant. They had no idea about how the world worked. They had a single tunneled vision of what they believed. And actually, this mirrored me because I was exactly like them. I didn't really know what existed. I didn't know what my choices were. And that's what led to the first book that I wrote, the fundamental books list for people who didn't go to university. Because what ended up happening was after I decided to change my life and to go, I didn't decide to change my life. What I wanted to do was figure out why it was that I tried to kill myself. I had to read a lot. I had to consume humongous amount of information. Why do people try to kill themselves? Why am I not motivated? All of this. And so the kids were mirroring to me or projecting, or the technical word is they were triggering for me what I had unresolved or the things that I was struggling with. And so what I found was that these kids were basically didn't really understand how the world works. They were breaking one of five things. Now, I'm yet to write this book, but I found that there were five things they were really struggling with. And I'm going to write a book about this. I was supposed to write this book first, but other things happened that forced me to write these other books instead of this. But the five things that they kept breaking were principles and laws. Some of these kids didn't understand there were some things that you could not change. So, for example, the schooling uniform, they would try to wear what they wanted, but you couldn't do that because all the other students had to wear the uniform. They would try to turn up when they wanted, but the school timing is set. It's stuff like that. Then they would break the rules. So, for example, so that's the first one, principles and laws. The second one thing that they would break was rules. They didn't understand that there are certain rules. So, for example, you can't just go around and set off the fire alarm just because it's fun or you don't want to be in the lesson. You can't just walk out of your lesson because you're frustrated. You have to ask for permission, that kind of stuff, right? The other one was seasons and cycles. In other words, they would do the right things or they'd be good or bad, but they just didn't do it at the right time. They didn't know when they should buckle down and focus. And they didn't understand that sometimes you've just got to walk away, or sometimes you've just got to lose. And so that was the other one. The other one was fundamentals and basics. What I began to realize is a lot of these students who were getting into trouble, they wanted to do what looked fun and what looked amazing and what looked good, but they just hadn't yet mastered the basics and fundamentals. They weren't good at the very basic things. And so I began to realize, okay, so things like turning up to lesson, having your uniform on, communicating when you want to go to the toilet, um, communicating when you're overwhelmed, that kind of stuff. They just hadn't mastered those. And the last one is, hold on a minute, I've even forgot now. So principles and laws, seasons and cycles. Hold on a minute now. Now, I don't know why this has overcome me. Let me just hold on 1 second. Why have I forgotten about this? The last one is hold on a minute. I literally don't know why I don't remember what this is. So principles and cycles. Do you know what? I'll come back to this later, because I don't know why, for whatever reason, right now as I'm talking about this, it's gone past my mind. But essentially, this is why I wanted to write this book because what happened was loads of the students kept asking me the same questions. They kept talking to me about the same things. They kept getting into trouble over the same things, and I wanted to basically give it in a book and say, look, if you read these books or if you understand and these things, you're going to understand a huge amount of the issues that are occurring in your life. You're going to understand why you're having so many issues with teachers. And so this book is really all about a lot of the world has already is not functioning because of today, is functioning because of what's happened years ago. So the laws that we live by today, many of them weren't written in the last 10, 15 years. Many of them were written hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and we're living by them. And so I was trying to basically get these kids to understand you want to focus on the things that you can change, not the things that you can't change. Because if you spend your whole life trying to focus on the things that you can't change, then you are going to end up frustrated, angry, resentful, rageful, bitter, and a failure. And if you focus on the things that you can influence, that you can change, and you understand how the rules work, and you understand how things can be, then you are going to become successful. Which leads on to the next book, because what ended up happening that I began to observe is these kids could not possibly think about that book or even think about buying that book because they'd been conditioned. And I had been conditioned. And so what I began to realize is, okay, I need to be able to explain to these kids that everything, basically, many of them, for example, were racist, homophobic, who were really struggling with the school. They did not realize that there is two types of truths. There is their truth and then there is a truth. The truth is incontrovertible. So the truth is like, for example, the law of gravity. It doesn't matter who you are. If you go on top of a building and you jump off it, you are never going to go up. You're always going to go down. And so what would end up happening was I would get into arguments with students and they would say things like, well, what if I had wings or what if there was a trampoline? In other words, they were trying to outsmart principles. Do you see how it all connects? In other words, they had been so conditioned by society, but they didn't even realize that they'd been conditioned. They didn't even understand child development. They didn't understand that the second part, which is that they were living within a truth, which is their own version of the world. But they didn't know that. They didn't know that there are people who are brought up in Christianity and they believe it to death. And the only reason why they believe it is because they grew up in a household where Christianity was the main faith position. They didn't know that, but they don't know that. They don't understand that there are some people who are Sikh, and from their faith position, that is the right religion. And what I was trying to basically get and writing this book is about conditioning, but also about potential. And I was trying to explain that many of us live and are born into these systems, whether it's the family system, the education system, the healthcare system, the foster system. And these systems are not built to tailor themselves to the individual. We have to change and adapt and tailor ourselves to the system. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is we can lose parts of ourselves. We can wither and die. We can lose the sacredness of our spirit, and we can wither and we can shrink, and diminish and not even realize that we have potential and the capacity for greatness. And so what I wanted to really do is whilst I wrote this book for students, really, I wrote this book for me because I wanted to know what is my potential? What can I do? Because so much of how I was living my life was determined by belonging and being accepted and being worthy and being loved. The problem is what I began to realize about myself, especially as I was writing this book and I was really exploring about myself, was that I was trying to I began to realize that I was conditioned, that I was not living my life out of opportunity and potential and capacity. Um, what I was living my life out of was fear, was survival, was conditioning, was belonging, was the feeling of being accepted. I could not understand that in order to thrive, you have to take a risk. You have to go for opportunities. You have to be the person who is proactive, not reactive. I can't spend my life defending. I have to spend my life creating. Right. And what ended up happening was that I saw, as I was writing this book, I began to realize that I, as Cassim, and many other students that I was working with were reactive. They were responding, not actually creating and building anything. And part of it is because they didn't think that they were worthy. They didn't believe that they had the capacity. They didn't believe that they could achieve anything. So why try? Why do anything? Why risk anything if you don't think that it's going to happen? Which is part of the reason why I wrote this book, because I began to realize that people had that fixed mindset. They didn't realize that they could poke at life and life could get better and things could improve. They didn't have motivation. They didn't have self-motivation. They were being driven by um, external motivation, not internal motivation. They weren't being driven by potential. What could they do? What could they achieve? They were being driven by winning, by chauvinism, by being showing off. And that is exactly where I was, and that's exactly what I was doing. And so that was part of the reason why I wrote that book, which led to this other book, which is part of the reason why I wrote How to Set Your Goals. Um, by the way, the previous book that I was talking about is The Best Kept Secret, Unlocking the Raw Inside of You. That's the book that I was talking about. And the previous book, so the first book was The Fundamental Books List for people who did not go to university. The second one is called The Best Kept Secret, Unlocking the Raw Inside of You. And the third book is called How to Set Goals, Six-Step Bull No Way, How to Get What You Want Starting from Nothing. The reason why I wrote this book was because what ended up happening was that as I began to unlock my potential and began to open my mind to the possibilities and start living my life not out of fear, but out of opportunity, I ended up lost. I ended up in transition. Now, you would think, yeah, Kasim, that's amazing. You're now free. No, that is not amazing because now I was in limbo. It caused me what in psychology is called cognitive dissonance because I was not where I wanted to be because I didn't know where that was, but I just knew that I didn't want to be where I had been before. So I was in limbo. I was lost. And so part of the reason why I wrote How to Set Goals was because I wanted to build my life. I wanted to build my vision. And so I studied lots of people who already had what they wanted. I interviewed people who had already achieved an incredible kind of life. And I was like, okay, well, I'm now going to have to decide for myself what success means. Since before, I was did be my what I defined success to be was based on what other people thought. I now have an opportunity to define success for myself, to define what a good life looks like for me, to look inside of myself and move closer to integrity and to this sacred part of myself and live from intuition, live from what do I believe I want? What do I believe is right for me as Cassim? And that was very, very difficult because, to be honest with you, there was too much. And so the reason why there was too much, because my mind was open to everything, and I needed a system. I needed basically a psychological framework because all of us need a psychological framework, whether that psychological framework is religion, it's atheism, it's politics, it is race, ideology. We need some kind of psychological framework. Um, or blueprint, if you will. And so for me, what ended up happening was that I went and studied lots of people who I admired. So people like, and who had had the life that I wanted. So people like Bishop T.D. Jakes, Dr. Miles Monroe, Jim Rohn, Tony Robbins, Brendan Burchard, all of these different people who were essentially writers, they were speakers, they were motivators. Basically, they were what is called a bridge. There were people who wanted to connect other people and help other people make a shift. They were the bridge. They would help people transition from where they were at previously to where they wanted to go. And this is part of the reason why I wanted to write books, not because I wanted to, but I wanted to bring the information to people that they needed in a because all my books are basically all stories. I use stories a lot, but I wanted to bring this information to people. Now, what ended up happening was in between setting, in between deciding what I want and stuff like that, as I said earlier on, I went through cognitive dissonance. And what ended up happening was that um, I basically spiraled again because I began to become so angry and resentful that I was like, my God, how could I have not known this? How could I not have known what was possible? I was so angry. And part of the reason why I wrote this next book, which is I Want to Kill Myself, a conversation with an unknown friend about suicide in the edge, is because I began to realize as I began to study myself, and this is now where I started going into therapy because I'd started therapy at this point in my life. I started to realize that in order to really come of yourself and to decide what you want and figure out what is right for you and what isn't right for you, you have to basically set up boundaries and you have to know what your limits are. You have to understand what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And what boundaries and what limitations you have. And in trying to understand this, you have to look at the shadow. You have to look at the dark parts of yourself. And as I went into therapy and I really looked at the dark, for example, what happened to me in my childhood, my biological dad dying, the parentification, the neglect that I experienced as a child, the abandonment, I began to realize that a lot of people didn't really want to talk about the dark aspect of the self. We only wanted to focus on the light, on the positivity, but actually, life is balance. It's the yin and the yang, right? It's the left and the right. It's the good and the bad. It's the positive and the negative. You need both. And in order to really live holistically and to understand yourself, you have to understand all of who you are, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the beautiful, the feminine and the masculine, the sacred and that which is not so sacred. You have to study all of it. And I began to realize that a lot of us, we just don't want to have these kinds of conversations. We don't want to talk about the deep stuff. We don't want to talk about the dark things in life. And I wanted to basically, in this conversation, encourage people to really begin to look at that, to really study that which they've gone through and that which is stopping them from moving forward. Because what I began to realize is shame. The word shame began to become into my vocabulary, and I had not heard of that word prior. I'd heard of anger, frustration, joy, depression, but I hadn't heard the word of shame. And what I began to realize is that so many of us live our lives trying to avoid shame, trying to not experience shame, trying to not experience failure, and going and looking at our material and what we went through, particularly in childhood and our traumas and the dysfunction requires that we may have to experience shame, humiliation, embarrassment, the darker emotions. And so this book was really about encouraging people who felt suicidal to understand, firstly, it's very normal, but secondly, to really look at it and understand that there are people out there who can help you to begin to look at this, whether it's psychoanalysts, whether it is Freudians, whether it's looking at your dreams. In other words, I was starting to encourage people to go to therapy, which is how the next book came about, which is Principal Conversations, pre-marriage counseling for engaged and soon to be married non-religious couples. Because what ended up happening was, as I started to look at the self and the darker aspects, relationships really began to become and get onto the scene because there is no way that you can truly understand yourself without understanding the relationships that you're involved in. And around this time, what had happened was I'd been to seven weddings, and five of my friends had got divorced. And I couldn't understand how. I was there at their wedding, and I didn't understand how they both vowed to love each other. And then a few years later, they were divorcing. And so what I began to realize is, and this is how so much of this was coming from therapy, and now this is how I ended up becoming a psychotherapist. I began to realize people don't want to talk about things, particularly boys and men. There's a lot of things that people just simply don't want to talk about. They don't want to discuss. They don't want to get into. The problem is, what it then does is when you put things under the carpet and you deny them and you repress them and you drink them away, it doesn't mean that they've gone. All that you've done is push them away to the side, or you've buried them. But just because you buried something, it doesn't mean that it's not alive. It doesn't mean it's not going to resurrect and come to the surface. It doesn't mean that it's not going to manifest itself. And so what I began to realize is that so many of the problems that people were having in life were in part due to the relationships that they had in their family, but also people repeating things, were repeating dynamics, and they were repeating dysfunction because they were living through a narrative and a script. And one of those was that they thought that marriage and kids would solve their problems. Um, and they were so built into the fairy tale and the script that they would not think logically and talk about things. They would not have conversations. And part of it is that so many millennials and adults, they want to only live in a fairy tale and the dream and not reality. And anything that takes them away from that, they don't want to deal with. And yet they then repeat the same patterns and the cycles then repeat over and over and over and over again. And a lot of people have been hurt by religion in the past, so they can't connect with it. They don't want to engage with it. And what I wanted to do is write a book in which I explored lots of questions that couples should really talk about before they get married. For example, do we want kids as a couple? Because if one of you wants children and the other one doesn't want children, you're going to have a serious issue on your hands. If one of you is thinking about saving and buying a house, but the other one wants a really high lifestyle, you have a serious problem on your hands. If you don't talk about boundaries and family and how you grew up, then it's going to manifest and it's going to present itself in the relationship. And so this is part, and remember, again, all of these books I didn't really write for people. I really wrote these books for me because I wanted to explore for me what was going on and how I showed up in relationships and how I could live an incredible life. Because in order to really live an incredible life, you really have to be able to have what in transactional analysis, a form of psychotherapy, is called contact. You need to have intimacy. You need to have connection. You need to have belonging. We're going into Maslow's hierarchy of needs now. There's human needs that people need, not want. You need these things. And I wanted to be able to mm, show up in the best way that I can in these relationships. Which leads me to the last book that I wrote, which is Why Should I Talk About My Feelings? I'm a Man, how to get boys and men into therapy. Because what ended up happening was I would meet boys and men, and I would be sharing a lot of these things that I've learned and my story. And they just found it, they would share with me that they found it really, really difficult to talk about their feelings. And I couldn't understand why. But also, part and a massive reason why I wrote this book, Why Should I Talk About My Feelings as a Man, is because as I began off today by saying, I have worked for the biggest mental health company in the UK for the last 4 years. And I've been going to all of these to do these assemblies and workshops all across all these schools. And the sign-ups have gone up to the organization because that's how my performance is measured. When you do your workshops and assemblies, are young people signing up to the platform to use it, to speak to the counselors, to join the forums, that kind of stuff. And the numbers of girls using our service had gone up, but not the boys. And remember, I'm going to boys' school, girls' schools, mixed schools, so I couldn't understand why the boys hadn't gone up. Um, And so I began to really look at why are the boys not talking about their feelings? Everywhere I go, all I ever hear is boys should be more emotionally intelligent. Boys should talk about their feelings. It's really important that boys talk about how they feel. It's really important that boys um, share what's going on for them internally. But clearly, boys weren't doing it. Men were not doing it. And it was causing a lot of conflict and angst in relationships. And so, what I wanted to explain to people is why this phenomena is present with so many boys and men. And is it true? And in how can therapy help? Because so many of the issues that people experience, whether it's male to female violence, depression, anger, frustration, mental health issues, many of these things can be resolved or certainly lessened or certainly um, you can get help with through therapy. But boys and men were not coming to therapy. So I was like, why is that? And that's what I wanted to look at and explore in that book. Which kind of leads me to now, which is again, this now links into the next book that I'm writing, which is why do some fathers abandon their children? Because what I began to realize is as I'm speaking to more and more fathers, as I'm speaking to more and more boys, a lot of this, and I'm working as a psychotherapist, a lot of the issues that we're experiencing in the world come from a lack of fathers, fatherlessness. And in Britain, particularly in the Black community, there's a massive issue with fatherlessness, and the conversation simply isn't being had. People don't want to talk about this conversation. People don't want to talk about it. It's a very taboo subject, even amongst the Black community. And I think part of it is that if we talk about this subject, then what it's going to mean is that the mother's position is less. If we talk about this issue, it means that we are basically blaming mothers or we are making it okay for father. In other words, what I've begun to realize is we don't really know why some men abandon their children because the narratives that we have predominantly been from the mother or from the child, not from the father. And from working with men in therapy, I was like, all of this stuff that people are saying doesn't seem right to me because I'm speaking to some of these men who don't have contact with their children, and what they're telling me isn't reflective of what society is saying. There was a lack of compassion, a lack of understanding, a lack of curiosity, a lack of spaces where these men are not judged and shamed and ridiculed and humiliated. And so you can see the theme in all of these is myself and men, right? It's about growth. It's about how can I serve people and help people to unlock their potential, to unlock all the different parts of themselves, to achieve greatness, to decide where they want and help them figure out for them what the obstacles are that are stopping them from manifesting and living out their lives as they want. That's really been the theme of all my workshops, not my workshops, the books that I've been writing. But remember, all of these books are all really related to me because, I didn't have my biological dad around. He abandoned me. And again, remember that I was looking at myself and looking at how I show up in relationships. So part of why I began to research this subject was really about me because I wanted to understand this for myself and how fatherlessness affected me as a person. So that is it. I don't know. That is it for this week. I don't know if that means anything to you. But I guess my final message to you is that you may have books within yourself. Your story can be used as a catalyst to achieve greatness, to redeem yourself, to unlock your potential. You are what you've been through doesn't necessarily have to be the end. Actually, it may be the beginning of who you become, of greatness, of success, of accomplishment. And what I would do is I would recommend to you that you yourself, you begin to look at your story. Part of the reason why I wrote this particular book, The Best Kept Secret, Unlocking the Raw Inside of You, was because I wanted to put my story down. I wanted to really delve into my psyche and really look at myself. And I would encourage you, you know, start to look at yourself, start to study yourself. What do you want? Where have you been? What's happened to you? What meaning have you put onto it? What have you been conditioned to do? Who have you had to become? And does it serve the best parts of who you are? As always, thank you very much for listening. I encourage you to like and subscribe or comment, or if there's a topic that you like, Cassim, I'd love to talk about it. Just let me know, and I will do my very best to try and uh, sort of talk about it. But otherwise, I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you very much for listening, and I shall speak to you very soon. Bye for now.